Good morning and a warm welcome to another match in the 2026 staging of the Public Sector Debate Competition. We're so glad to have you join us. I'm Aniki Clark, Communication Lead in the Transformation Implementation Unit. And if you're just joining us, you missed a rather rich conversation, I'd call it, between the Jamaica Information Service and the Bureau of Standards Jamaica. And the GIS has secured their spot in advancing to the octafinals. Continuing the action, who from this team will advance, this match will advance to the octafinals? We have in proposition the Queen's School, and in opposition the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. They will be debating the moods, be it resolved that political clientelism in Jamaica is a more significant obstacle to national development than external economic shocks. Big mood, that you know. Don't you agree? Yes? I agree. Right. Let's get to meet the teams who will be debating this mood, starting with team proposition, the Queen's School.
Hello everyone, I am Samoya Jones Hussey.
Good morning, I am Nicole Colesso.
Good morning, I'm Talia Hall.
Thank you very much, team proposition. Let's give them a warm round of applause. And let's get to now meet team opposition, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining.
Good morning, I am Neil Henry.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
I am Neil Henry.
Good.
Good morning, I'm Teshoibo.
Good morning, Shalika Darby.
Thank you very much, team opposition. And having met the teams, it's now time for the judges to introduce themselves. And we have, as always with us, the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, JADE. Judges, please introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Aniki. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jermaine Barrett. I'll be the chair adjudicator of this match. Best of luck to everyone.
Pleasant day, everyone. My name is Jerome Reynolds, and I will be one of your wing adjudicators for this match. Good luck.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chantal Hughes, and I'll be a wing adjudicator for this match.
Thank you very much, judges. Let's clap them too. Let's give them a little encouragement for adjudicating in what is going to be, without a doubt, a very hotly contested match. And at this point, all that is left for me to do is to hand over to Jermaine and to wish the teams good luck.
Thank you, Aniki, and a very special thank you for that encouragement. Ladies and gentlemen, we have met the teams, and you would have realized that both teams having 3 debaters. The format is such that each speaker has a different amount of time within which they will be presenting. The first speaker presents within 7 minutes. The second speaker presents within 6 minutes. The third and final speaker presents within 5 minutes. That's per team. After the first 2 speakers on each team has submitted their speech, we will have the first segment of cross-examination. We'll have another segment of cross-examination after the second pair of speakers. Thereafter, we'll have a 1-minute pause, and then we'll conclude with the final speeches, beginning with the opposition team, their reply, followed by the final debater in the match, the proposition reply speaker. Teams, please be mindful of the time signals. When you hear the first ding of the bell, it means that you've spoken for 1 minute. Another ding of the bell signals that you have 1 minute remaining in your speech. 2 dings of the bell signals that you have consumed the allotted time, but you don't have to stop there and then, because we give you 15 seconds thereafter, at which point we continuously ding the bell, signaling that you must exit the stage and make way for the continuation of the debate. Of course, points of information are encouraged. They are allowed after the first minute up to the last minute of your presentation. That's specifically for the first and second speakers on each team. All right, debaters, now that we have been refreshed with respect to the rules, it's now time for us to get this debate started. At this time, I invite the first proposition speaker to open this debate. Of course, she comes to us from the Queen's School. Hear, hear.
Madam Speaker, honorable adjudicators, members of the opposition and fellow government members, good morning. Today, this House must decide what is truly holding Jamaica back. The opening government firmly believes that political clientelism is the greatest obstacle to Jamaicans' national development. Political clientelism is a system where politicians exchange jobs, contracts, money, or favors, crime, social mobility, and for a better quality of life. It's a links culture where opportunity depends less on merit and more on political connections. National development refers to sustainable economic growth, strong institutions, reduced crime, social mobility, and a better quality of life. The International Monetary Fund defines external shocks as sudden economic disruptions outside a country's control, such as recessions, oil price increases, pandemics, natural disasters, or decline in tourism demand. Our case today is that political clientelism is a more significant obstacle to national development because it weakens the very system Jamaica needs to survive and recover from external economic crises. My substantives will be advanced in four clear claims. Firstly, I will show that external economic shocks become far more destructive when political clientelism weakens state institutions. Secondly, I will demonstrate that political clientelism prevents Jamaica from building a resilient and diversified economy necessary to withstand external economic shocks. And thirdly, my Deputy Prime Minister will elaborate on how political clientelism transforms temporary external shocks into prolonged economic stagnation. And lastly, how it further distorts national investment priorities. To my first substantive, external economic shocks become far more destructive when political clientelism weakens state institutions. Madam Speaker, the reality is this. The external economic shocks in and of themselves do not determine whether a country succeeds or fails. Madam Speaker, what determines outcomes of external economic shocks is the strength of a country's institutions. External economic shocks become far more destructive. Far more destructive when the political clientelism weakens state institutions. When hurricanes hit, strong institutions coordinate reliefs effectively. Infrastructure is built efficiently and resources are distributed fairly. When COVID-19 hits, strong institutions manage public health effectively, distribute economic support properly, and diversify the economy strategically. But, Madam Speaker, when political clientelism does, it weakens those very institutions before the crisis even hits. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Jamaican economy contracted by approximately 10%. As a result, the tourism industry collapsed. The government revenues declined sharply, and unemployment increased significantly. Madam Speaker, the reality is this. Jamaica was not the only country affected by COVID-19. Almost every single country in the world was affected. So I beg to ask the question, why do some countries recover faster than others? The answer is simple. Institutional strength. And herein lies Jamaica's problem. Jamaica institutions have long weakened by corruption and patronage. According to Jamaica Transparency International Index, Jamaica scored a 44 out of 100 on the 2024 Corruption Perception Index. That matter becomes weakens public trust, procurement systems, disaster response, and economic management. Madam Speaker, this has massive consequences because when institutions are weak, disaster preparation becomes inadequate, recovery becomes slow, and public money becomes wasted, and national crises become prolonged. Hurricanes and economic shocks create crises, but weak institutions and clientelism determines how badly Jamaica suffers by undermining effective recovery and support systems. External shocks, create pressure. Political clientelism weakens the country's ability to respond. To my second substantive, political clientelism prevents Jamaica from building a resilient economy. Madam Speaker, Jamaica will face external vulnerabilities as a small developing state. Jamaica cannot control global recessions, pandemic, oil prices, climate disasters, or fluctuation in international markets. Those realities are unavoidable. Therefore, the only sustainable path to development is not eliminating external shocks, because that is impossible, but rebuilding a resilient economy capable of withstanding them. That requires economic diversification, strong institutions, long-term planning, investment in education and innovation, productive industries, and efficient governance. But, Madam Speaker, political clientelism prevents all of these. And in this is where the root issue in this debate lies. Because political clientelism fundamentally changes the incentives of governance itself. Instead of governments making decisions based on national productivity, economic sustainability, and long-term development, clientist systems reward politicians for maintaining loyalty networks, distributing patronage, and maximizing short-term electoral survival. That means that political success becomes tied not to national transformation, but how effectively politicians can maintain systems of dependency. And once that happens, long-term development becomes politically inconvenient. Madam Speaker, this is political clientelism, not merely a problem within the system. It is a root cause of Jamaica's long-term vulnerability. As a result, economies remain undiversified, productivity remains weak, institutions remain inefficient, and precisely why external economic shocks hit Jamaica so severely. According to World Bank, Jamaica GDP per capita in 2019 remained below the 1972 peak. That means that despite decades of passing, Jamaica struggled to achieve sustained long-term growth. Additionally, Jamaica remains heavily dependent on tourism, remittances, and import. Madam Speaker, that is what makes economy extremely vulnerable to global disruptions. Madam Speaker, this creates a dangerous cycle of economic vulnerabilities, because when economies are not diversified, unemployment rises rapidly during crisis, government revenues collapse, COVID-19 exposes clearly. When tourism collapses, Jamaica experienced severe economic contractions, right? Diversification remained limited for decades because clientist politics prioritize short-term political maintenance. As a result of this, the proposition temporarily rests.
We thank the first proposition speaker for her remarks and now call upon the first opposition speaker to do likewise. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, today's discussion is straightforward. We are evaluating whether internal political practices, such as vote buying, outweigh the devastating immediate consequences of external economic shocks that repeatedly cripple Jamaica's economy, infrastructure, and productive sectors. As first speaker, I will establish the foundation. Our second speaker will weigh the evidence showing why shocks decisively outweigh clientelism, and finally, our third speaker will dismantle the proposition's arguments, exposing the flaws in burden, causality, and weighing, ensuring team opposition prevails. Mr. Speaker, I think you will agree with us that the proposition has, beyond a reasonable doubt, failed to satisfy its burden in demonstrating that political clientelism is the greater hurdle than external shocks in the context of Jamaica's national development. Before moving forward, Mr. Speaker, I must correct some glaring errors in the argument brought forward by the proposition. They haven't at all they have made claims, but they haven't substantiated. Now, Mr. Speaker, permit me to put forward the opposition's case. And let me be clear. We are not suggesting that political clientelism is harmless. It does have negative implications. However, when weighed against external shocks, its impact on national development is quite frankly minuscule. Mr. Speaker, what is important is context. Jamaica is a small island developing state. We are net importers of goods and services, where most primary inputs for manufacturing and agriculture, and manufacturing are imported as well. For every dollar Jamaica earns, it spends $4.41 on imports, leaving our nation highly susceptible to fluctuations in international markets, trade agreements, logistical disruptions, and foreign policies. Jamaica's dependence on tourism and remittances compounds this vulnerability. In 2025, remittances totaled 3.49 billion Jamaican dollars, representing more than 15% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, we are the poster child for vulnerability. Not only are we small and import dependent, but we are also highly exposed to costly hurricanes and natural disasters. The most recent disaster, Hurricane Melissa in October 2025, inflicted damages totaling 1.952 trillion Jamaican dollars. That is approximately half of Jamaica's 2024 GDP, making it Jamaica's costliest disaster to date. Bananas and plantains were practically decimated. Our poultry sector is still hanging on by a thread. And think of the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, or the 1980s global trade liberalization, or the 2008 global financial crisis. All of these shocks followed steady domestic progress by Jamaica, and yet they were outside of our control. In a blink of an eye, all of this progress was wiped away. Decades of development undone in a mere 24 hours. With each crisis, families who had worked for years to acquire various assets had to restart from zero. Lives were lost, livelihoods destroyed. Businesses were forced to close. Government resources that could have gone to education, healthcare, investment, instead had to be redirected towards emergency. Rather than advancement, our focus shifted towards recovery, which often takes decades or even longer, depending on the scale of the damage. Mr. Speaker, like Melissa, these external economic shocks occur without warning and fall outside of the government's control. They strike suddenly. They overwhelm the state's ability to
Point
respond.
of information.
Not accepted. Their scale is often so great that no amount of preparation can fully mitigate the damage. Mr. Speaker, when is the last time you fill up a tank? Geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East have sent fuel prices soaring here in Jamaica. Transport, food, and electricity costs
of information.
are increasing. Not accepted. Now this is because a politician, none of this is because a politician give a man 10 grand for a vote. It happens because of Jamaica's dependence on imported fuel and trade. Mr. Speaker, understand clearly that geopolitical conflicts are simply out of our control. We cannot dictate their outcome, yet we are not spared from their impact. Even the most ethical and efficient government cannot control wars overseas or global inflation or disruptions in international markets. This is even worse for countries like Jamaica. Yet, the proposition is trying to convince you that political clientelism is the larger issue. Mr. Speaker, let us buy into their delusion for a second. Let us say it is the larger issue and focus on eliminating clientelism by tomorrow. The reality is we would still be vulnerable to gas crises, future hurricanes, global recessions, international conflicts, and rising commodity prices. That is because of the simple yet very logical premise that external shocks attack the very foundation of national development. It attacks economic stability, food security, infrastructure, employment, and national productivity. Mr. Speaker, our case is clear. External shocks serve as Jamaica's macroeconomic reset button, eclipsing political clientelism in scale, impact, and reach. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, the opposition strongly rejects the motion, and we pause.
Thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Team Opposition. We now move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining gets a chance to ask questions of the proposition team, the Queen's School. Each question is limited to 10 seconds. Each response limited to 45 seconds. You have 3 questions. Team opposition, you may now proceed to ask your questions.
Can you guarantee that the removal of political clientelism will remove the impact of global economic shocks such as a recession?
Go ahead and repeat that question once more.
Can you guarantee that the removal of political clientelism will remove the impact of global economic shocks such as a recession?
No, we are not debating the impact of that external shock. What we're debating is our ability to recover, our ability to achieve sustainable long-term development. That is what's at hand today.
Can you quantify or even logically explain why a multiplier effect outweighs the initial shock and losses?
Repeat.
Can you quantify or logically explain why a multiplier effect caused by a shock outweighs the initial losses?
Queens, you have to respond.
No.
How do you quantify economically the impact of political clientelism on Jamaica versus economic shocks?
We quantify that by looking at historically how long Jamaica has taken to develop. From our inception in 1960s, we have been facing underdevelopment. So while external economic factors hit us every now and then, political clientelism is in the root, the DNA of Jamaica's society.
All right, we thank the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining for those questions. Thank you, Queen's School, for those responses. Queens, you may now pose your 3 questions to the opposition team. Here.
If external shocks are the greater obstacle, why have some countries facing similar shocks, like Barbados, developed more successfully than Jamaica?
So what we have found is that, unlike the proposition, development is a multi-factor activity. So it's not solely based on political clientelism. As a matter of fact, we found that as an equalizer, every country has some amount of effort that they have to put to respond to a global economic shock. And so for that reason, it comes back down to how well these countries respond to these shocks.
All right, I'm glad that you identified that. So would you agree that institutional strength affects how effectively countries respond to external shocks or crises?
We agree that institutions are important for recovery, but what we will not agree with is that clientelism is the sole driver for institutional strength, and that is where your argument is failing.
All right, thank you. Thanks to both teams for that segment of response. Oh, I'm advised you have another question, Queens. Go right ahead. Sorry. Apologies for that.
All right. Are you measuring significance by immediate damage or by long-term developmental outcomes like growth, investment, and productivity?
So we are actually measuring it by both immediate and long-term impact, and quite frankly, the data is there to show that economic shocks have severe immediate, medium, and long-term impacts on national development.
Now we can thank both teams for this segment that just unfolded. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue now with the Deputy Speaker. That's the second speaker from the Proposition team, the Queen's School. Let us make her welcome. Hear, hear.
Side opposition, and my fellow Jamaicans. Nations do not fail simply because crisis occurs. They fail when poor governance erodes sustainable development. As clearly stated by my first speaker, we do not deny that Jamaica faces serious external challenges as a developing state. However, we must identify what is preventing Jamaica from achieving sustainable development despite these shocks. Madam Speaker, my first substantive is that political clientelism transforms temporary external shocks into long-term economic stagnation, which severely undermines national development. External shocks may create temporary pressure, but political clientelism transforms that said pressure. We see where hurricanes pass, global recessions eventually stabilizes, and oil prices fluctuate. But when state resources are distributed based on political loyalty rather than national interest, recovery becomes structurally crippled. Side opposition wants this House to believe that Jamaica is simply a victim of unfortunate circumstances, as though external shocks alone determine development or national outcomes. We firmly reject that simplistic analysis. Why? When political favoritism dictates disaster response and reconstruction, recovery becomes economically inefficient. Businesses remain closed longer, agricultural production declines, tourism recovery slows, and unemployment rises. Consequently, government revenues fall while debt burdens increase. This forces the country into prolonged economic decay long after these external shocks itself has passed. For example, following Hurricane Beryl in 2024, damage and losses were estimated at nearly 2% of Jamaica's GDP, with billions of dollars required for rebuilding infrastructure and agricultural sectors. However, the long-term developmental impact of the hurricane was not the hurricane itself, but rather Jamaica's government system ability to efficiently restore economic activity quickly, allocate resources fairly, and rebuild productivity efficiently. Delayed reconstructions keeps roads broken, schools closed, and businesses along with farmers losing income for extended periods. The result is lower productivity, weaker investor confidence, and reduced national capacity to invest in essential sectors like healthcare, education, and long-term economic diversification, thereby deepening Jamaica's long-term vulnerability to future external shocks. A domino effect has been created. Reduced productivity reduces tax revenue, then reduces state reinvestment, which weakens diversification capacity, thus increasing future vulnerability. This is why side opposition characterization fundamentally fails. They focus only on the initial shock itself. We are examining what prevents sustainable development long after the shocks occur. Now on to my second substantive incentive. Clientism distorts national investment priorities and traps Jamaica in long-term developmental decline. Let us be frank. Development requires governments to allocate national resources efficiently, transparently, and according to national need. However, within a clientelist political system, state resources are often distributed based on political loyalty and electoral advantage. Instead of prioritizing sectors that are capable of strengthening Jamaica's productive capacity and reducing dependence on external markets, clientelist systems prioritize short-term political gains with limited long-term economic value. This turns development damage from temporary into a structural problem. When public investment is distorted by political patronage, economic growth slows because national resources are not allocated where they produce the greatest developmental benefit. Infrastructure projects become inefficient, productive sectors remain underfunded, and public spending generates weaker long-term results, or returns rather, for the economy. According to the IMF anti-corruption research, corruption linked to patronage and clientelist systems can reduce economic growth significantly. One study found that just 1% increase in corruption, I repeat, just 1%, reduces economic growth by a whopping 0.72%. Clearly, side opposition has not accessed this data. This matters significantly for developing economies like Jamaica, where efficient use of limited national resources is critical for sustainable development. When economic productivity weakens, unemployment rises, government revenues decline, and debt burden increase as the state becomes increasingly dependent on borrowing and external assistance to compensate for weak domestic growth. This is exactly why, side opposition's analysis remains incomplete. They treat external shocks as they are the primary cause of Jamaica's economic vulnerability. But vulnerability itself has been deepened over decades of political systems that prioritizes patronage over productivity and short-term political survival over long-term national transformation. Madam Speaker, external shocks test the resilience of a nation, while political clientism determines whether a nation progresses or remains trapped in a structural underdevelopment. This is why it remains the more significant obstacle to Jamaica's national development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the second speaker from the proposition side. We now go to the opposition side to hear from their second speaker. Here.
Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, my worthy opponent, good morning. I rise to deepen our case and to firmly establish why external shocks, not political clientelism, are the greater barrier to Jamaica's development. But before I proceed, let me briefly respond to the proposition. They would have you believe that clientelism is the mother of all our obstacles, yet what they fail to confront is this: the passage of the impact does not pass with a shock, but can create a legacy of death and costly recovery. Even the most well-governed nations are brought to their knees by forces beyond their borders, that is, external shocks. Mr. Speaker, that is the reality Jamaica faces. Mr. Speaker, when the global economy trembles, Jamaica does not merely feel a slight inconvenience. We get an economic tsunami. And as they say, when a foreign sneeze, Jamaica catch cold. As outlined by my first speaker, Jamaica is an import-dependent economy, heavily reliant on tourism remittances, foreign investment, imported fuel, and international trade. Therefore, when wars erupt abroad, when oil prices soar, when global inflation rises, or when recessions hit major economies, the consequences descend upon Jamaica with brutal immediacy. This drastically destabilizes national development and, as shown by my first speaker, results in quantifiable regression along key development imperatives. So while proposition wishes to narrow Jamaica's developmental challenges to political clientelism alone, they ignore the larger storms surrounding the island. My role is to deepen that case and weigh directly against political clientelism by showing three things. One, how shocks constrain human development immediately. How external financial conditions bind Jamaica's investment space. And 3, why shocks are upstream causes that intensify clientelism.
Point of information.
Not accepted. To my first argument, Mr. Speaker, imported inflation and terms of trade shocks are proven direct, immediate constraints on human development. Human development is not abstract statistics. Much of our development indices, poverty reduction, manufacturing, health, and industry, are measured at the junction of food, feed, fuel, and fertilizer. As a net importer, we import inflation when the cost of essential commodities increases overseas. Since the start of 2026, we are seeing rising fuel prices as a result of the Middle Eastern conflict. Remember, food, feed, fuel, and fertilizer are linked, and a shock to one is a shock to all. Fuel prices alone have risen by 27%. That is taxi fare, Mr. Speaker, not accepted. Bus fare, lunch money, and as an authority from the Ministry of Agriculture, the price of agricultural inputs have increased over the last quarter. In April, the Minister of Energy announced that government had to absorb 1.3 billion Jamaican in losses just to temporarily buffer the rising fuel and to remove the 4.50 cap to taxpayers from paying 11 billion in losses, which is 2/3 of government revenue. Once more, Mr. Speaker, not accepted. Once more, Mr. Speaker, if this crisis continues, this will determine whether parents can afford food, whether children can remain in school, whether our hospitals have resources, whether citizens can find jobs. We are dealing with this moot as our reality. Mr. Speaker, when fuel prices rise internationally, transportation costs increase locally. Farmers pay more to distribute produce, businesses pay more for electricity, supermarket price climbs, inflation rises, and suddenly, Mr. Speaker, the ordinary Jamaican mother in Moko or Lucy Hanover, not accepted, must choose between paying light bills and buying food. Mr. Speaker, let me move to my second point. External financial shocks drive Jamaica's debt dependence while constraining private investment and capital inflows. External economic shocks breeds dependency on foreign debt, often paired with severe austerity measures. As recent as May 2013, trailing from the 2008 crisis, Jamaica borrowed $932 million under an extended fund facility to stabilize an economy facing a severe debt to GDP ratio of 147%. High unemployment, low growth. In this cycle of shock and recovery, as much as 50% of government spending went to servicing national debt, while only 25% to wages and 20% splintered among education, security, health, and other services. Jamaica is not alone in this, Mr. Speaker. Barbados, for example, had a debt to GDP ratio of 77% at the start of the crisis, and by 2010, 63% of total government revenue went to their debt servicing, and they borrowed $290 million from the IMF to assess in debt servicing. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on causality. External shocks actually create the very conditions in which political clientelism thrives. Even countries like Brazil that have put measures in place to reduce clientelism are not spared today from the effects of global economic shocks. Governance may affect how well a country cushions the blow, but governance does not create the international oil crisis, the global recession, or worldwide supply chain disruptions. Mr. Speaker, political clientelism, while harmful, operates on a slower and narrower scale. It may distort opportunities or influence access to resources. But it does not shut down an entire industry overnight. It does not trigger imported inflation across an entire nation. It does not collapse foreign exchange earnings in a matter of weeks. External shocks do. The opposition pauses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for that speech. That was the second speaker from Team Opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, we move now to the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the proposition team, the Queen's School, gets a chance first to ask 3 questions of the opposition team. Queens, you may ask your 3 questions, limiting each of those questions to 10 seconds. And of course, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, your responses are limited to 45 seconds. You may begin, Queens.
Hi. If clientelism is as insignificant as you stated, how do you explain inefficiencies in procurement, disaster response, and public investment decisions in Jamaica?
It's important to highlight that development is not a direct link of clientelism. Essentially, you can have a government that never practiced clientelism and still have the same inefficiencies that you're talking about, and you're failing to prove that causal link, which is why, again, you are failing in the argument.
I don't agree.
What exactly about a hurricane or recession on its own prevents Jamaica from efficiently rebuilding without referencing how state systems manage that recovery?
Again, you're linking state systems to clientelism, and that is why you're failing. You cannot highlight to us how it is that clientelism as a direct impact is causing slow recovery from a hurricane. These can be linked to several issues, including destruction of the very buildings in which government officials operate. How do you quantify this?
Queens, do you have another question?
Yes. If external shocks are temporary, why should they outweigh a system like clientelism that operates continuously across every election cycle?
We just want to highlight again that for us, as our second speaker said, shocks are not temporary. The impact does not pass overnight with the shock. So the recovery and the cost of recovery, the effort that has to go into recovery can last generations. It's a legacy of debt and destruction and recovery, a cycle that we are still dealing with today.
Thank you very much, the Queen's School, for your questions. Thank you, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, for your responses. The opposition team, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, you may now pose your question to the proposition team, the Queen's School.
Isn't your best argument actually that we need resilience because shocks are a bigger constraint?
No, it's not resilience. Shocks occur. We understand and we do agree with you that the impact can be lasting. However, proper governance determines whether we are able to move forward or be trapped in underdevelopment, which is what you're failing to prove.
If Jamaica fixed procurement tomorrow, what would be the effect of the global tourism downturn on jobs and revenue? Essentially, if Jamaica fixed procurement tomorrow, would a global tourism downturn still cut jobs and revenue?
Repeat the question once more, sorry.
If Jamaica fixed procurement tomorrow, would a global tourism downturn still cut jobs and revenue?
Yes, it would still cut jobs and revenue, but that's where political clientelism amplifies the issue. If it is that political leaders are more focused on survival rather than national interest, that issue becomes amplified and entrenched and never resolved, which is what we're proving.
Can we separate how much today's violence or any other issue is driven by clientelist policies versus gangs, firearm trafficking, or other transnational or international drug markets?
Garrison communities within Jamaica again, it was entrenched in our system from the 1960s, right? Garrison communities are maintained in Jamaica to ensure that the electorate remains in power. So there's no guarantee ever that we're going to diminish or get rid of garrison communities, because keeping garrison communities ensures that the government remains in power.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that exchange of questions and answers. We're now going to pause for 1 minute, after which we'll resume the debate with the presentation from the third speaker from the opposition side. Then thereafter we'll conclude with that speaker who will come from the proposition side. Teams, your 1 minute pause begins now. That signals the end of your 1 minute pause. At this time, we invite the third speaker, the reply speaker from Team Opposition, representing the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, to conclude the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Clientelism can pose obstacles, and indeed they can be a problem. But what they have not done and what they cannot do is to honor their burden of showing how political clientelism, things like targeted welfare benefits or vote buying, pose a more significant developmental obstacle than the proven cataclysmic and injurious seismic shocks to our global economy and to Jamaica's economy. What they have not done is to show an exclusive causal link between clientelism and government policies. They would have to show that there's a clear linkage between clientelism and bad governance, and of course, again, they have not done so. Mr. Speaker, we have won the debate without a shadow of the doubt, because we have proven with history and evidence that Jamaica's own experience of progress is constantly being eclipsed by and eroded by disasters. In our lifetime, we have heard, Mr. Speaker, and my first speaker talked about it, the 1970s OPEC crisis, the 2008 recession, COVID-19, the Russia-Ukraine war affecting fertilizers and food, and of course, you are seeing the news, an ongoing global economic crisis, including geopolitical tensions external to Jamaica. The Jamaican lived experience is one of cycles of progress, regression, and efforts towards recovery. We have shown how each crisis has its own measurable index of regression as spending is diverted from development goals such as poverty reduction, education, water access, and job creation towards resuscitation and rehabilitation, and of course, a generational borrowing crisis and debt. We have won, Mr. Speaker, by proving that this is not political science fiction. This is mine and your lived reality, and it is the lived reality of the ordinary man. Our paradigm is proving how critical external shocks can be, especially when they strike at the junction of food, feed, fuel, fertilizers, and of course, that is transportation, electricity, agriculture, every industry, you name it, none is spared. Mr. Speaker, Society generally hears the arguments raised by Team Proposition, and of course, it's a fairy tale. Clientelism is more harmful. Politicians actually raise it the most, accusing each other of these practices. And prior to us conducting our own research, we also had those biases. But Mr. Speaker, facts also speak truth. Our opponents from this Queen's School are also talking about the challenges that pertain if developing countries were, of course, to transition from one model to another, wherein they do not practice clientelism. But our research actually shows that clientelism cannot be the core driving factor when, according to national surveys, they're actually a baseline. 90% of countries around the world, whether highly developed or underdeveloped, have clientelism as a root. 70% of nations, including developed and developing nations, have reported high levels or standing levels of clientelism across the phases of their development. How is this a driver? Statistically, again, voters believe that clientelism has little difference. In Jamaican vernacular, they take the handout and they vote you out, independent of whether or not a cash handout is provided. Wardo 2008 highlighted that it has no effect on voter turnout and it has no effect on voter shares. Most shockingly, Mr. Speaker, clientelism is actually considered beneficial to some of the most vulnerable groups who are targeted for welfare support. So how does the proposition respond to this? If you were to really take the opposition at their best, in their world, let's call it the land of if. If you reduce political clientelism, then development will outpace the effects of economic shocks. Mr. Speaker, Brazil has done this. Right now, the same country is facing national oil constraints, which is triggering emergency measures to safeguard continuity of national oil supplies. Brazil's annual inflation accelerated by 4.14% in March 2026 alone, and it is largely driven by food and transportation costs, which are rising as a result of fuel price hikes globally. Mr. Speaker, we can't afford to live in their land of if. We live in when and now. There are 10 cataclysmic threats that we are facing for this generation. A global famine. The World Food Program has signaled that crisis-level hunger will continue to escalate in 2026 and beyond. Are you ready? The US dollar could collapse tomorrow, causing a massive financial crisis, disrupting trade, crashing assets, and severely constraining food supplies, and potentially shifting the world's economic power to a new power. Are you ready for this? Which man's $10,000 in a shirt can be returned to fix this problem? Mr. Speaker, finally, I want to remind you that their very argument survival is hinged on an idea of clientelism. They have given you no direct examples of causality, of how clientelism is a greater driver to underdevelopment than an economic shock. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as we have outlined, this is a baseline. It has no effect on voter turnout or elections or even governance policies. They took a burden that they could not carry. And we have proven to you, Mr. Speaker, exactly why the proposition has honored its responsibility to this House. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the third speaker from the opposition side. Now to conclude the debate, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome the third speaker from the proposition team representing the Queen's School. Hear, hear.
Madam Speaker, my fellow opponents, judges, good morning. The opposition dare to say that keeping in a state of dependency works. Rubbish. Teach a man to fish and he will fish another day. Keeping a man stuck is never the solution. They say that we have not shown cause. We have said clientelism creates a domino effect where productivity is reduced. Tax revenue becomes reduced. State reinvestment is reduced, which increases the same vulnerability that side opposition says economic shocks create. We ask, if we don't have proper governance, how do we fix this problem? How do we move forward? They said clientelism does not address the long-term issues. But why is Barbados, that has a stronger governance system, demonstrate more efficient resources allocation, thus giving the man more than just his $10,000? We have listened to the passionate claims made by team opposition, who have presented myopic arguments that emphasize the impact of external economic shocks. We have cited a common ground. Yes, external factors affect the country's development to some degree. However, we assert that in overstating the impact of these external shocks, which are outside of Jamaica's control, team opposition has downplayed and disregarded to the full extent to which political clientelism grossly and consistently undermines Jamaica's capacity to respond effectively and adapt accordingly to these shocks. External economic shocks have created the opposition argues that external economic shocks have created the greatest damage to Jamaica because they can instantly destroy infrastructure, reduce tourism, and cause major economic decline. However, while we acknowledge the reality that external factors may affect economic growth and productivity, these shocks are temporary disruptions, not permanent barriers. Many countries have experienced crises influenced by global conditions, but not all remain stuck in patterns of persistent underdevelopment or stagnation. The opposition argues that economic shock affects all Jamaicans regardless of politics, proving they are more significant. However, the severity of its impact depends heavily on how effectively governments manage national resources and implement strategic economic policies. The opposition totally disregards the role of governance and structural policies in mitigating economic hardships. External shocks are uniformed events, but outcomes are not uniformed. This variance requires explanation, and the most consistent explanation variable in development literature is institutional strength and governance quality, which clientelism directly weakens. The side opposition removes responsibility from domestic governance and assumes Jamaica has no meaningful control over its developmental outcomes. If ignored, the fact that many small states facing similar pressures have developed more effectively through stronger institutions and better governance. Madam Speaker, imagine Jamaica as a ship navigating treacherous waters. External economic shocks are the storm, powerful, disruptive, and at times unavoidable. But the captain of the ship represents governance. A skilled and competent captain strengthens the ship, manages resources wisely, navigates difficult conditions, and ensures the crew survives the storm. On the contrary, when the ship has an inherent structural defect, such as political clientelism, which dominates governance, the captain prioritizes personal survival over national interests. Critical positions are given to political allies instead of the most qualified. Resources meant to repair and strengthen the ship are diverted, misused for political gain. Corruption weakens compromised structure of the vessel meant to endure the crisis. Ultimately, it's not the storm alone, but the quality of governance that determines whether the ship stays afloat or sinks, showing that political clientelism poses a greater obstacle to Jamaica's development than external economic shocks. The proposition rests.
And some very strong clapping there. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This debate has now come to an end, and it is with delight that I turn over to Aniki, who will dismiss us shortly.
Sure, thank you, Jermaine. The teams did not disappoint. Let's give them another round of applause. I listened in awe. I love debating naturally, but this topic was something that really had me glued. And I must say the teams did well. They pulled the arguments apart. So I'm not envious of the judges who will now go to deliberate and return in a few minutes to sum up the match and give us the winner as well as the best speaker. Well done, teams. And stay tuned. And stay tuned to viewers online. It's okay. You want it. You're just glad it's all over.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the point at which I reveal the results of the match that just ended. But before I do so, I want to just commend both teams on an excellent treatment of what we feel was an excellent motion or moot. Thank you very much. Now, what was our moot? It had to do with a question as to determining the impact on national development of political clientelism versus external economic shocks, right? Which of the two have a greater serve as a greater impediment to national development? The Queen's contends that it is in fact the political clientelism. And they point to a sort of a root cause analysis. They say to us that when countries like Jamaica are impacted adversely by external economic shocks, those shocks are significant and the pain that is felt is great because of political clientelism. And they do a fair amount of work to mechanize that, to explain to us how is it that political clientelism does in fact weaken institutions such that the impact, the adverse impact, is more severe. They contended as well that not only is the instantaneous impact severe, but also the persistence of that impact is prolonged by virtue of continued political negative effects, right? Clientelism. Now, the opposition team cites a number of examples as to the kinds of deep, painful traumas that Jamaica experiences when economic realities outside of Jamaica are adverse to the economic development of Jamaica. And they point to the severity of those and suggest that it is really difficult and naive even for one to expect that those shocks, as intense and as consistent as they are, it would be reasonable for Jamaica to sort of bounce back from these shocks, separate and apart from economic, the political dynamics of the country. They say to us as well that these shocks are oftentimes, they occur often and they are significant, and they point to these shocks as being global in scale. At that point in the debate, we're wondering, insofar as the shocks are global and many other countries manage to recover from those shocks, why is Jamaica not recovering at a pace similar to other countries who are equally impacted, right? And we feel like the Queen's School gives us a response to say what is unique in Jamaica's circumstance, not necessarily unique globally, but relative to the other countries that are advancing, despite, for example, the oil shocks, despite, for example, the other shocks that affect countries globally, is the fact Jamaica's political infrastructure, Jamaica's institutions are so weak that it does impede the development of the country at large. We liked the examples on both sides, examples that prove one versus the other as being the greater impact. We also like the causal relationship. So when Queens tells us that the political clientelism is that which weakens the institutions and makes the society more susceptible to feeling the severe pain, whereas we hear from the opposition team, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, they tell us that it is the economic realities external to Jamaica, the pain, the traumas that are inflicted upon Jamaica, external to the nation state of Jamaica, that ultimately leads Jamaica to adopt political clientelism. We feel that on that point, the Ministry of Agriculture team does not do enough to prove to us that in reality, adverse economic realities or shocks does in fact propel the society towards political clientelism. And so we felt like they needed to do more to prove that. On the other hand, we feel that Queens does a lot of work to prove, one, the existence of political clientelism, which the motion presupposes exists, but also they prove that this does in fact have a contribution to the depth, the duration of pain as it exists, emanating from economic shocks, global economic shocks. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the points are as follows. 284 points to the winning team, and that contrasts against 273 points to the second place team. The winners of this match in the public sector debate competition for 2026, the second round, ladies and gentlemen, they are the Queen School proposition. Congratulations to the Queen School on winning this match, and very well tried, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. Ladies and gentlemen, the best debater also hails from the winning team, and that speaker is the second speaker, Nicole Pelosi. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying tuned to this match and keep the conversation going because, hey, these debaters did a lot of good work in terms of expanding and exploring the issues, but there's a lot more to be said on this issue. So please keep the conversation alive. We will see you in a few moments from now for the third match of the day when two Titanic teams face off against each other on an excellent move. Thank you.